And now I get to open to this really wonderful panel. And it's truly a joy for me that I get to be listening to these folks. And the way that we're going to do it is we'll have Amahra speak, and then Nabil, and then Dhelia. So I'm going to do Amahra's intro and then hand over for Amahra to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. So Amahra Spence is a cultural worker and spatial practitioner, guided by lineages of Black imagination, spatial justice, and the more than human cosmology. She invests in the intimacy of transformation to explore its possibilities across design, space, systems, governance, as rehearsal for liberation. As the founding director of MAIA, Amahra works to prototype community-rooted, life-affirming infrastructures in the support of Grandad's House. She is also an organizer for Black Land and Spatial Justice Project and currently visiting lecturer of Architectures of Abolition at Birmingham City University. Please give your warmest welcome to Amahra.
Thank you. She sounds lit. It's such a pleasure to be here. I feel like I'm really blessed to be with my people. I feel like I'm here mostly as a fan of who I'm sitting alongside, and people who I've met in the space or I'm familiar with. So just collective big up for all of us, I think, who are trying to do what we're doing in these times. I You didn't even hear the story about my granddad. I always love to speak about my granddad, and in general my elders. I think I'm definitely my grandfather's granddaughter. But one of the reasons that I do so is because he was the first storyteller that I ever knew, though he wouldn't articulate himself as such. His house was the first piece of social infrastructure that I ever experienced, so he would have never called it as such. And the spaces that he cultivated and that he grew, they were really the first life-affirming systemic responses to what he was experiencing and what his peers were experiencing, though he would never use that language. And he was one of my first teachers. My granddad came to the United Kingdom in 1960. I don't know if you know, but a lot of wild things were happening at that time. He came to England in 1960, landed in literally one of the most toxic places in this country. There's a teeny tiny unofficial territory in the West Midlands, where I'm from, if you can't tell, called the Black Country. Does anyone know the Black Country? Anyone from the Black Country? Too much. The Black Country, which gets its name because of its history as part of the Industrial Revolution. There were so many workhouses, coal houses. It was a big part of the infrastructure that built up the Industrial Revolution and transition. It was situated in almost the middle of England, right? So in 1960, my granddad lands into this area, predominantly white working class area, predominantly working class, and this real direct experience of racism as part of his everyday. I say my granddad landed in, metaphorically and literally, the toxic soil of the Black Country and built this most life-affirming, convivial, beautiful space that we call his house. And some of you might recognize his house or the type of house that he created because your own experiences I hope you might have been blessed to encounter in one way or another. But this front house that was pristine, and there's glass cabinets of everybody's grandchildren and neighbors' kids and everybody else's kids, and the sofa that was always covered in plastic and don't get it dirty, never spill your tea on it, fancy china and all this kind of stuff in the cabinet. You go into the next room and it was so full of life, it couldn't even be contained in the one room. Too much furniture, how is it all in here? Why is there 2 tables and 6 couches and the room is this big? but that's where like the stories were told at the dinner table, like, you know, all of the reasoning, the conversations that we would have, the laughter, the critical conversations. That was a space that I became deeply politicized, and at the same time my soul and my spirit and my belly were always fed, right? Kitchen is full of like food and laughter and love and stories and song, and depending on what day it is, Marvin Gaye or like Kirk Franklin. I don't know. But this was the house that was like, what would it mean to build from this spirit, right? And I was always, I was drawn to that as a premise. What does it mean to build infrastructure in the spirit of Granddad's house? About 8 years ago, oh my God, I had a dream. I really had a dream. That sounds so. I actually had a dream. I was heavily pregnant, and really believe that for me, I've had 2 children now, and apparently when I'm pregnant, it becomes a real sight of like huge dreaming, like real deep dreaming. So I had a dream of this space, and it functioned kind of like if a hotel met Granddad's house. That's kind of how it worked. I woke up and I was like, we just need to make this happen. It's beyond me at this point. We just need to make it happen. I'm getting excited, so I'm going to try and slow down. I had this dream in 2015, and started like articulating this dream out loud. I've grown up in a community that was very much like, when you have an idea, keep it to your chest, don't tell anybody, you know, they'll take it and they won't do it as good, so better you keep it to your chest. And I keep trying to like reject that impulse, that conditioned tendency that's like this, you know, and I know where that comes from. But I wanted to really challenge and see, if we keep sharing openly and if we keep leading with trust, what does that do? So I kept talking to as many people as I could about this dream, kept trying to meet people and find people who also have similar visions or like similar missions. Even they want to build something like this, or you know, ecosystems like this, like the spirit of Granddad's house. They recognize it as something else. Fast forward to 2020. I said, you know, we don't have we don't have money, right? We don't have the money to build something at the scale that we're really trying to build. What can we prototype like today? Like, what can we do right now with what we have? And I'm from a small neighborhood in Birmingham called Ladywood. And Ladywood, over the last 10 years, for a bit of context, Birmingham is not, well, before 2020, Birmingham was not familiar with the scale of gentrification that cities like London are. And of course, that escalated much quicker. So over the last 8 years, 7, 8 years, we really made an intention that says we want to build outside of the city centre. Birmingham is a very centralised city. All infrastructure, resource, economic flows, energy, jobs, opportunity are concentrated in the city centre, which means our communities, poor communities, black communities, working class communities, are often on the fringes or further afield, or they keep getting pushed out, right? We'll probably talk about social housing at some point. So we were like, we want to build, we want to invest in where we are. We want to dig deep. We want to keep our roots here. We don't want to get pushed out. We don't want to be victim to the gentrification story that we know. How do we build in our community? There was an opportunity to take on a house, a 4-bedroom house in Ladywood. And we turned it into what we call a site of imagination. And in the spirit of Granddad's house, and maybe houses that you may know, this one building has to become so many things. We're in another example of this right now, right? One building that our community is able to steward into something, we have to turn it into about 84 different things, right? Because of what we don't have, and the opportunity that we get to do this, we know how to shapeshift with buildings, right? We know how to turn it into multiple things. So essentially, with Yards, we said, how do we make the invitation to be part of this building as porous as possible? Like, how do we build a program that opens up that porosity, that makes invitations to as many people as possible to come and co-dream, co-build this with us? One of the invitations that we started with was Free Yard. And Free Yard was our way of saying, how do we share the resources that we have of any scale resource, whether that's literal financial money, and that might be pennies, through to I know somebody who can support you, through to this, through to that. Like, how do we literally share all the resources that we have, that this building can offer, that our community can offer? How do we make that as easy as possible, as frictionless as possible? What kind of capacities are needed for that? So Free Yard was one of the ways that we tried to create this porosity. And what that looked like was, of course, being proximate to wonderful organisers and groups, and organisations like Healing Justice London. We know that building the kinds of capacities that we need to practice this in real time, right? To practice, what does it mean to build something that's life affirming in the context of ongoing violence that we're all experiencing? We have to think multidimensional about the kinds of capacities. So we said, how do we start with a wellness day? One of the days of Free Yard, it was 3 days basically. We opened up the house, anyone could come in and use the space. But of course, we know that that sounds like a terrifying proposition to some people who've never been used to that kind of offer. So we said, well, how do we create a compelling invitation? One day was a Wellness Wednesday. So we said, how do we really start with the personal capacities? How do we start with the healing justice work? How do we build in that collective capacity, intelligence, skill? How do we work with other healers in our community and make the kinds of healing spaces that we know are needed just part of the everyday? Who does that create an invitation for, and who doesn't it? You know, we've got paper, we've got like anything that you could possibly need. We've got other people, we've got connections. Come and use the space. And then the last thing was just an open house. If you felt like any of these things were like binary and you didn't know where to fit, and you just wanted to see what was on the other side of the door, how do we just have a day where at any point you could just come in? We've always got food, we've always got support, we've always got people, we've always got energy. And what happens then when we start to like grow that out and practice that? It took a lot of I'm gonna wrap up. It took all of the weight from us being the ones to have to create this infrastructure. We're the ones that have to, like, you know, do the making and offer the solutions. Suddenly it was like, how do we do this as a collective practice? People started to remix and recreate what those porous invitations meant, and then it wasn't our project. I mean, this is I'm skipping over lots of stuff, but I want to get to the conversation. But for us, that porosity of invitation was, how do we just share as easy as possible?
Thank you so much for giving us a little bit. I know it's a taster insight of the multitude of things that you do, but particularly appreciated you speaking to like this thing of whatever we have, it has to do 150 million things. And you know, Free Yard being a space where when you are deprived of resources or also time and capacity, then you're trying to shapeshift all the time and open that up, and how much your space has been doing that, and extended. So I'm looking forward to our conversation where you can show where else that's gone, and where else that shows up. Nabil, it's you. I'm gonna do read out your bio. I feel like it's really important, especially when it's Black and global majority people, that bios are read out properly, because we're often like there's, and it doesn't do justice, but we're often like erased of like the multitudes that people have done. So I know you guys will find it cringeworthy, but I feel it's a part of my responsibility to give you your due. So by day, Nabil is a built environment professional with a keen interest in urbanism, placemaking, sustainable development, and place vision. By night, he's a cultural producer that uses creative practice to deliver change-making projects that draw focus on the relationship between space and stories. Other strands of his work include the exploration of spatial politics, identity, culture, and migration.
Thank you. So I'll give you a little bit of a backstory and make sure you stop me if I. I'm from Northwest London. I'm from an estate called the Chalkhill Estate in Wembley. We're situated right next to the Wembley Stadium, and I've lived the majority of my life there, and it's just like any other social housing estate. I came as a refugee to the UK, and sort of joined a story that started before me. I wasn't an English speaker, and so my Jamaican aunties and my Nigerian uncles and my Somali cousins all taught me and contributed to my very being. So if anything, I very much see myself as a product of multiculturalism in the UK. One thing that I noticed quite a lot growing up, aside from the love that I experienced from all my neighbours, was the rapidly changing cityscape of London. Don't really leave the M25 much other than to see Amahra, but I'd experienced sort of from my early teens to my early 20s the rapid change of the city skyline and the dynamics that formed and the mainly the power dynamics between the landowner and the communities who traverse a particular space. So I took some interest and decided to read up, and knowledge is power. If you read too much, you become a dangerous person. So I've got a bit of a big mouth. I don't know how to stay silent. And one of my first opponents in the gentrification of Northwest London was Quintain Estates, who built 85 acres of Wembley Park. And one thing I noticed quite quickly, aside from the rising rents, was the slow but steady shrinkage of land being under public ownership, being transferred into private ownership, and sort of seeing the product of that throughout the course of my life, and sort of asking the question of who are these cities being built for, really stuck in my mind. One thing I was sure of is it certainly wasn't for us, and there were a number of reasons as to why we would be ushered out of the private estate, because there's a bunch of coloured youths walking through the public space, and none of my neighbours could really afford the rate of the commercial units in order to open up their businesses, unlike the high street next door. So I was quite vocal. I caught the attention of the private developer, and a sort of challenge was set to me. Like, if you think you can do anything different, come give it a go. So I was invited to try and help them shape the city and make the needs of my people more known in the exercise. I learned a lot in the process. I was with them for 2 years, and I left in a really bad way. But it taught me one thing, and I'll refer to a quote by the phenomenal Adrienne Marie Brown, who sort of just poses a question of whose imagination do we live in? And that couldn't be truer when it comes to gentrification and city development in general. So what I'd learned is London and the UK is made up of a mosaic of land parcels. And slowly but surely, these land parcels are being removed from public ownership due to austerity measures going back decades. And it was only in a brief period of time following World War II, when Britain was feeling a bit more socialist than it is feeling now, where we saw a boom in post-war social housing. And since then, the supply of social housing has declined in a very, very rapid rate. I think this year and last year there were virtually zero social housing estates built. And due to sort of historical hierarchical structures, it tends to be the black and global majority population who find themselves within these spaces. And multiculturalism, not just as a concept, but the people who risk. And in the shaping of the city as we're seeing today, their needs or their sort of contributions to city shaping is drowned out by this pursuit of capital and profit. The issue is when you build a city on the promise of a 15% return on investment, you're going to need to design a city to extract capital to make sure you fulfill that promise. And so London very much is turning into a city that's being designed and built to take your money. So there's places like King's Cross, Wembley Park, Elephant Park, even the more London development where the GLA building sits. They're all designed to extract as much capital as possible. And so if we sort of look underneath all of these processes, the people driving this have dreamt up a place to attempt to be some form of a functional city, but also is able to produce enough capital to fulfill a particular promise. Whereas post-war housing was a place to house people, and that was the basic sort of investment into a population. There's so much I want to touch on, but we can talk on the conversations and so a lot of my work centers around sort of shifting those power dynamics by using existing legislation and infrastructures, the planning system, economic systems to sort of address the current I don't want to say failure, it's not nice, but the current decline in public services and public ownership, and to preserve the spaces that we call home through collective enfranchisement, which is included in a manifesto that I produced 2 years ago called Privatise the Mandem. But yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much. And I also really appreciated you bringing in the kind of contextual ways in which what at points public meant could have and did mean something to how it is operating right now. And I think both being able to see the decline, I want to say failure, because there's failure in it too, intentional design, strategic failure, and divestment, but also this ability of us being able to reclaim that. And to thank you for bringing that in. I think probably one of the most critical points of when we're saying neighborhoods for life, and I think for those of us who have grown up in contexts in which your only form of resource is not the right word because it still feels like transactional, but you only have each other. And I remember, like, I grew up on an estate where you were sharing, like, 4 houses were sharing one guy's car, or number 20's uncle, he was a builder, so he built everyone's shed, but people in the neighborhood would like collect wooden things from around the area, and then like over the summer he would build everyone's shed. And like, actually, thank you for bringing in these already forms, and it's granddad's house as well. It's all the different ways in which it's how the estate functions, where you are finding ways to have other economies, other ways of living and thriving, and to bringing in this like very necessary alternative isn't also for me the right word, because it's actually just a way of being. So appreciating you bringing that into all the different ways that we are going to have to. I keep thinking of like Fred Moten's Undercommons, like this fugitivity that we will need to have as we do this work, and we're entangled in these structures that at any moment could even take away the house, even take away the building, even could take away police and criminalize. And so appreciating you bringing that in, very necessary. We'd usually have like a break at this point, but I actually wanted to do a little bit of a switcheroo, which is that in the spirit of homes, we actually have next door one of the social practice artists that we have as part of Rehearsing Freedoms is Bahsan, who are a Somali queer and trans group and who've experienced Islamophobia, securitization, all of these forms, and they've had to exist hidden. And so they built their own home in the next room, and to simulate what would it be like to have their own home away from being securitized or surveilled. And so instead of going to break right now, we maybe can close a bit earlier and you can go and spend some time in the space and have a look at the space. And I might just go to questions if that feels okay. Cool. I'm going to open it up and then I'll throw it out to you all to ask us questions. I think particularly, Dhelia, you invited us. I think it's an expansion of the conversation where it actually needs to be if we're talking about neighborhoods for life and what are the things that survive. And it isn't the buildings and it isn't the structures, but actually like the relationships that we make. And so I would love for each of you to maybe talk about your connection to that relational piece and what are the alternatives beyond the kind of structural infrastructures that you can see emerging. What are maybe examples of that? I know, Dhelia, you just gave an example, or if you can speak to what's possible in those spaces. I don't know if, Amahra, you want to kick us off, and then Nabil, and then we can go back to Dhelia.
I have so many thoughts that are alive. I love this because this is what conversations do right now. I'm all sparky and I just want to sit in with what you all shared, because one of the biggest things for me is my peers have literally been my lifeline. We always talk about you know, for lots of us, we understand how important imagination is as a concept, as a practice, as a thing to nurture. Some of us will be familiar with like radical imagination. We have to grapple with challenges and structures at the root and build, and practice imagination from that perspective. But I live in a community. I'm part of a community that has just called that survival. And for me, that's one of the things why I love talking about granddad and my community. I'm also a nomad as well, and that having lived in lots of different kinds of accommodation and being unhoused and know that kind of temporality intimately is relationship has literally been a lifeline. And so at MAIA we talk a lot about our organizational structure. One of the biggest contradictions of starting an organization, which, by the way, I didn't want to start. I never wanted to start an organization. I wanted a job and I couldn't get one. And having to literally create the infrastructure that we need for our survival is something that unfortunately too many of us know. So I never wanted to start an organization, and it's been an ongoing contradiction ever since, because that container that you then enter, what you have to hold, all of the things that you're weighing up all of the time, what this means, it's always on my mind. One of the livest sites of contradiction was around what we consider due diligence to be. And part of why what I love, oh no, I'll probably answer that in another question. No, I'll skip that bit. What I love about being an artist though is that I never felt like due diligence was a binary thing, like we have to do this or we don't. Like if we become an organization, that's it, like we're part of the system. I didn't have that kind of I didn't jump there, or I didn't go to that in my mind, because I felt like everything was a site of reimagination, even how we are resourced. One of the main things that I have loved acknowledging is that MAIA as an organization survived for 8 years without any funding. And survive is, it wasn't like beautiful and amazing all of the time, but it was absolutely, we were doing the work at the scale that we could, at the pace that we could, with whatever we had. And I'd never feel that like, money could go away tomorrow, so then our organizations or our work must disband. For me, one of the biggest contradictions was that the work, MAIA's mission is my life's mission. Like the organization's work is my life work. I don't need that container to do this work. And so for me, where I come alive is because I know my peers also are co-invested in the same mission. We are co-invested in a world towards liberation, whether that's their mission statement, your mission statement, or not. We are co-invested in that work. And for me, I wanted to think of our organizational structure not as a pyramid where power trickles down from a CEO, not as a flat structure. We tried it, it didn't work for us, and we can talk about all of the reasons why maybe later. But I wanted something that was much more nuanced, much more dynamic, much more able to hold complexity and contradiction. I wanted to think of an organizational structure that understood that lots of our peers are co-invested in the same mission. What if we understood that our mission was the sun, and that different proximities to that sun weren't value propositions? It's not the closer you are to the sun, the more important you are. It's just what kind of scaffolding is needed for this planet to survive. And then what happens if this planet dies and new ones are formed? I wanted to think of an organizational structure where our more than human kin, our ancestors, children who are yet to come, were also part of this mission, right? And so we just started to play with what if our organizational structure was like a solar system, and we've been in that dance of practicing what does that mean in real time? Like, what does that mean when we've got we've got a team and they want clarity about what's next, and and all of the discomfort that comes up with uncertainty? What does it mean when even within our organizational structure, we have to acknowledge that our local council, who doesn't invest in us in any way, is also a part. They have a relationship to the sun. They have a relationship to this. So for us, it was like, where do we get to practice that? And I think just one tiny example I would love to give of, I think one of the biggest things for me is about paying deep attention to what is around you. In lockdown, I saw a lot of my friends and my neighbours, my community, they were leaving their jobs, or they were being made redundant, or they were put on furlough. They were able to spend time with their kids. They were able to spend time with what they actually love. And a lot of them started cooking. A lot of them were like seafood boil bags, chicken wings, mac and cheese, lobster tails. Where are you getting this stuff? A lot of people were just starting like cooking, and they were making boxes, and they were like, yeah, I'm just trying a thing, I want to spread it around my community. And I looked at that and I said, if we were going to build infrastructure in the spirit of Grandad's house and it looked like a hotel, what would the food and beverage offer be? What if we were able to completely reimagine supply chains in this super hyper local way, and in every way we were going to invest in our neighbours, in the people who are most proximate to us? Then how would we make a food and beverage offer that acknowledged that valued that centered that? So what do we need to experiment today? So we were just like, well, we've got some money left over from a project. Let's invest in this hustler who wants to be on the straight and narrow in his business. He doesn't know how. Let's work with him. Let's help him. Let's support him. And through that, we created this like rotating kitchen offer, which essentially means that every day at Yard is lit. You should come. Oh my gosh, you'll be fed so well. But also, it's like that was one of the first ways that we were building relationships with people who they weren't recognized by the institutions. They weren't recognized by funders. They didn't know that world. They were just on their thing, and we just saw them. We knew them. I've grown up with these people. It wasn't like it wasn't like a parachuting in. It was, you're my people. How do we support each other? And every opportunity of like noticing has cultivated something else.
I don't know how I'm going to follow up on that. One thing I'll sort of gladly share with you guys is I'm not really an artist. I'm not really a creative. I've sort of dedicated a lot of my time into thinking about systems and how I can sort of remix some of these systems to serve my community. So if we sort of go back to the title, Rehearsing Freedoms, I focus a lot on the word freedom and trying to understand how we can achieve it. And in order to understand what freedom is, you have to define it. And the way I frame freedom within my work is someone who's free has choices. They have options. and people who are not free are constrained and are provided a select, a predetermined group of options to choose from. Everyone in this room, unless some are squatting or homeless, are subjected to some form of contract, and that could be through housing, that could be through work, and that constricts you. And a lot of us are born into contracts. We'll live. My mum's house is. I grew up in a house that was contracted, and so the history of a contract goes all the way back to Anglo-Saxon feudal systems. So once upon a time, the earth was a common treasury for all. It was viewed, land was viewed as sort of being owned by God, and human beings didn't have the authority to determine what happened within a space. Everyone had a temporal relationship with resource within space. A lot of things happened, and the literature is sort of sporadic and contradictory at times. But long story short, once upon a time, a group of lords decided to create enclosures and say, this piece of land is mine, and anybody who enters is trespassing. Those who I allow into my land are called serfs. And they operate within this space in accordance to how I want them to behave. Fun fact, another word for serfs is villains with an E. And that term has sort of grown to become a derogatory term for working classes. It's a parallel from the past. So one thing I've come to learn in sort of understanding a lot of Western society is that we're all subjected to contracts whether we like it or not. And one thing that really excites me about Farzana's work, Amahra's work, Dhelia's work, and everyone who's sort of testing the boundaries of this system that we're in, I'm laser focused on trying to understand, in this world of contracts, in this world of legislation and policy and agendas, how can I create an oasis of freedom for my little corner of London, and how can I share that with other corners of London so we produce oases? Is the plural for oasis across the city, and ultimately look at new ways to govern space. One which is reflective of we're not using alternative, non-Western hegemonic value systems, which is reflective in the in the organization that Dhelia was talking about. There are value systems here that are much more important to us than rent, for instance. So a lot of my work is I sort of frame it in two distinct tranches. So there's fighting, and then there's farming. So the fight is the acquisition of the land in which we occupy, and inheriting the freedom that comes with being a landowner and being able to explore choice within this particular environment. The second part is the farming. It's the MAIAs. It's the steel pan group. It's the rehearsing freedoms. It's the versions of reality that we can exercise, being protected from a world full of contracts and agendas. So it's extremely dangerous, because once you provide people freedom, you're not guaranteeing they make the right choices either. So by no way is it a utopia. In fact, if we just break down the word utopia, it's Greek for no place. It means it doesn't exist. It's not real. What I'm interested in exploring is how we can have these oases of freedom and allow them to make to make mistakes, allow them to, through time, oscillate between positive and negative states so that they can retain good practices that serves them and abandon negative practices that harms them and people around them. So allowing people to learn from experience. I know that there's some debate about whether empirical knowledge is as worthy or important as sort of rational knowledge. And it's I was saying to the group earlier, like, chaos has to ensue in order for true freedom to be achieved and lessons to be learnt. Because one of the most dangerous things I'm seeing happening is curation across the city. So you walk down this street, you'll look at the boots, you'll remember you need some deodorant, you'll go in and spend money that'll contribute to rent, return on investment, and then you'll go to the public park and there's a little cafe, you'll grab a coffee, and then you'll go through and there's a little art gallery, and in that art gallery you will only see the works of artists that we are politically aligned with or voices that we value. And that's just a small snippet of a walk through sort of privately owned space. I want to see a mosaic of different experiences and different realities, because I feel like there's a lot more richness that comes from that. This room is an example of it. I'm sure people have different backgrounds and different worldviews, and probably everyone doesn't agree on the same thing. But if you all did and everyone agreed on the same thing, it would be pretty boring. We wouldn't have anything to talk about. So goes back to what sort of life we want to live collectively.
Just before this, we had a really interesting conversation that expanded the ways in which we're attending to this conversation. And for me, even yesterday, we had a Tai Chi for Resistance space, and someone who experiences distress walked in, and they were clearly not well. And the first thing they kept saying is, "Don't call the police, don't call the police." And if it wasn't us, and if Alex hadn't handled it so wonderfully and Jalal, police would have been called. And so, you know, part of when I'm thinking about, even if it wasn't these kind of infrastructures that we need to build, and to your point, Nabil, of how the interface of our lives, especially when we're most vulnerable, like when we're sick and unwell, are entangled with these contracts. And part of why healing justice exists is because actually interacting with just the public health system, whether it's mental health or physical, which are public entities, have been, in my personal context, deeply violent, deeply criminalizing and non-functioning. And we can't wait for more people to be lost. We've got to just build those alternatives. And they get practiced. They get practiced on the estate when your neighbor is your therapist, and that's the house you run away to, and they look after you and they feed you and they take care of you. That's those are the functions, right? And we're trying to simulate that on scale, and also trying to make it sustainable. And so I think that there is, and then how do you practice it where the labor doesn't also fall on the same working class racialized bodies to do that work? And how does it that our full-time job doesn't become carers of the most vulnerable, but we can also be resourced to access life as we deserve? So all of these entanglements and contradictions are definitely shown up in what does it mean for us to like constantly be met with, Indi Johar used the word social codes, and I feel that speaks to some of like this deep archaic way in which our lives are riddled, entangled, whatever word you want to use with it, and how do we like unlock it and reactivate other bits. And for me, I think it's also not new in Islam. You can correct me, somebody on the panel, if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but there's Delia will laugh because I also get like super Muslim on panels, but like in Islam there's this concept called waqf, right? And it's a cradle to grave social welfare provision system, and it basically, from your pension to when you're born to the trading and commerce, is all held in this welfare provision system. It's not new, like it already exists, but its value system is very different. It's not for profit. It's not for its relational politics is very different. if one business is open, the other one closes. You know, they all go for Friday prayers. Like, it's the relational structure of it is not rooted in capitalism or neoliberalism and colonization. It's rooted in the other things that make life worth living, which is relationships. And so, and it's not specific to Islam. I think, you know, indigenous traditions also organize life towards source and land. Like, I think that is also an invitation, which I've heard in what you were saying, Delia, of like, what does it mean to organize our lives around what we value, which is family, which is connection, which is not like, am I going to pay my mum to like take care of me? And I think that's the broader invitation that is being called and reckoned at this time, when we are having these conversations. So I just wanted to bring in some of those touch points as we try and like steward this world to death because it needs to die, and birth a new relational politics that isn't rooted in infinite acquisition and capitalism and these contracts.
Stop me, because I'll go on a lot about this. So, first, I'll dismantle the term regeneration, and then I'll speak on sort of roots and passages. So, regeneration as a term, if you look at the etymology, genesis, to bring life to something, and so to say regeneration, which is common language now, it's used in policy, it's vernacular that the general public uses, insinuates that these estates are places of death. There is no life here, and it requires a genesis of an act of creation in order to breathe life back into it. So I've been working really, really hard to sort of shift the language, and also to challenge sort of language around this place isn't a place of death. It's where life really is sort of presented in its best form. Some of our most celebrated people in Britain come from estates, and some of the most creative people come from estates. So how can they be creative and sort of channel creative power if they've come from a place of death? Regeneration is very much an imposition of a particular viewpoint as to how a space should be spatially configured. So if you look at some of the post-war housing, a lot of the brutalist architecture, for instance, it was intentionally made quite bare, quite skeletal as well. Concrete frames, and leave it at that, and let people live. Let them put their plants out. Let them put their let them hang their laundry. Let them put their dog out. Let them paint the walls. It was meant to host life. Now, a lot of what we've seen is, I call it the miseducation of the architect. So architects are generally, I feel sorry for them. I'll be honest with you. There's two major contributions to the miseducation of the architect. The first one is their creativity is killed at university, and they are only rewarded when they meet the brief. And the brief is always written by people who want to pursue profit. I can say this because I work in the industry and I know this inside out. So in order for an architect to be successful and to fulfill the contracts that they hold within the house that they occupy, they have to produce a salary, and they have to sort of bow to the needs of capital. Now, how do I say this without being rude? Yeah. A lot of the decision makers who shape the city are monotonous people who design by numbers and numbers alone. And so they will enact their vision. They will build a city from their imagination, without the training and without the value systems, which a lot of Black and global majority people identify. And so they will challenge concepts around socialism, especially if you're a capitalist, and see no value in what potentially a post-war, maybe even defected USSR architect like Erno Goldfinger. They won't appreciate the socialism ingrained in the buildings they design, but rather they will create new routes and new ways to design a city that they feel fits into their worldview. And it's starkly different depending on what values people hold. Does that answer? Or am I waffling? You can tell the truth.
Do you want to say
I got so many thoughts. Yeah. So we were in Sheffield in August with Resolve Collective, and they threw out an invitation, like what would we want to like share, like what parts of our practices or what things might we want to offer all of the people that we're together with. And I was politicized by lots of things, Granddad's living room, one of the things, but also hip hop. For me, hip hop was one of the genre was built on a critique of the public environment, right? It was built the very first, don't push me 'cause I'm close to the, the song, right? Google them lyrics, right? And tell me that's not an urban planning critique. I swear to God, please, like, if we could get the lyrics right now, right? That song, the first hip hop hit, right, was a critical analysis of the built environment, the public projects. So for me, that genre was a way of acknowledging. So I've always been interested in, like, well, it's not how do we not just acknowledge, but how do we use our creativity, our expression to propose new things, not just critique. Critique is so important, but if we stay in critique, like, what else do we build? And I always feel very really strong about saying I don't do anti-work, I do propositional work, right? I know at the same time I can only say that because I'm in a peer group, peership ecosystem with other people who do the anti-work. That's why I can turn around and say I don't do that stuff, because I want to build, and my way of dismantling is building. I can only do that because my peers are also doing that anti-work. Another space that I was really politicized was John Singleton films. And so my offering was we watch Boys in the Hood together. And for me, one of the, I feel like it's like it should be Hollywood gold, but it's not, apparently, or not widely, when Lawrence Fishburne gets on the mountaintop and gives the gentrification 101 speech. Like, I was like 9 watching that film, and I was like, oh, I understand spatial politics. But that was the first thing that I saw that was helping me have an analysis about the way that cities are designed, in the way that Nabil studies hard, by the way. He knows everything about everything. But like to get there, nobody teaches us. And I love what you said about architecture school, because oh my God, let me just be careful. But the education system itself not only stifles creativity, it in no way confronts its own complicity in collapse, in climate collapse, in it completely like abdicates any. Okay, basically, I'm so sorry because I'm just not even finishing sentences. I'm so frustrated that architecture schools do not talk about the ways in which the built environment is complicit in climate collapse. Like, I don't understand how we're not talking about that sector as one of the biggest enactors of climate violence and destruction. So the fact that like creativity is stifled, we don't even really talk about the problems, we just carry on doing. Indy Johar talks about you know, I've experienced homelessness. We say that we need to build like 300,000 homes imminently, right? Indy Johar says we don't even have the climate budget to build that. Never mind the skills, the resource, the capacity, the investment. We, in an ecological, environmental sense, we don't even have the carbon budget to build at the scale that we need to build, which is why repair work is so critical. One of the reasons that I loved watching Boys in the Hood with my people is because we were having this conversation about the built environment, about the fact that these kids are actually dying in the alleyways, you know, and maybe it's because they've been blocked off, and maybe, you know, for all of the reasons that violence is designed into our streets, that we were having a conversation with peers who I felt like it was the first time that there's a maddening that I think is happening when we see what we can see. We feel like, I always feel this like, God, why can no one else see it? And I think that's why I feel so heightened about Palestine at the moment. Is like we've been like, we know this. We know. I thought we all knew this. I thought like, what? We don't know this? Oh, this is the way that erasure happens. Oh, this is how violence is enacted. So just watching that film with my people was like, oh, thank God. But I also just want to take a moment to just for me, family is always a difficult thing to use as a reference for lots of reasons. And I think one of the things that I'm really yearning for, and I talk about like a more than human framing increasingly, is not just because I find families complicated dynamics, but also, you know, in the context of capitalism, in the context of actually even families are rooted in contracts in different ways. What I'm really longing for is a more than human framing that can acknowledge not just our animal kin, not just the relationship with, if we actually had if we had to do the labor of drawing water from a well, we would understand why, you know, we would understand that relationship differently. We would understand labor. We would understand all these different things. We'd have a completely different value system, but not just a relationship with like water, with the elements, with animals, with more than human kin, with algae as the eldest ancestor. But also, I want a framing that acknowledges that many of us are not considered human in this current paradigm. And so even when we talk about like families, or we talk about like, I really hate that architecture and the built environment in the last few years just started to lean to like, we need to be human-centered. Like human-centered. You don't even see us as human. You don't even see us as human, and that's not just a critique of architecture, but the world that we're in, right? So what a more than human framing that acknowledges just the nuance and the ways in which violence is enacted, like to us as people who are not afforded humanness. And the last thing on that I wanted to say was, I always think about, you know, I think in the time of like Islamophobia, you know, I don't even want to say it's on the rise. It just is. I come from a people, many of whom are who follow the way of Rastafari. I come from like people and communities and lineages and histories where the people were considered vagabonds, were othered, were considered criminal just for having an anti-systemic oppression lens and for embodying that. So I always love to surface the fact that when we are actually in this work that we're in and calling what we're calling for and practicing this is the reality, is we are literally criminalized, we are othered, we are killed in the streets, and this isn't like a what's the word, exaggeration. This is real life. And when like you guys said, like this is dangerous. No, it's really, really dangerous. And so there's just something for me that's like acknowledging what it is to navigate through these times of violence. It literally is a matter of life and death. Like you know, urban planners and built environment specialists will go and have their like, let's just go and do this. Like we'll design this, we'll layer in these things, and young people die. You know, and I think that we just have to keep saying that, not in a way that we freeze, but so we can be really hold what it actually is to do this work and to navigate in these times. I have many incoherent thoughts. I'm so sorry. I feel a lot of things right now.
Thank you. I think there's so much in a lot of what you've all said that you're just going to get me off on a tangent, but I want to make sure that we've had space for a few questions. So maybe if we can take a few questions and then all at once, and then you can pick up whichever ones you want. Any questions? I have tons of questions, so, you know, don't let me have all of them.
I think you did say some of it, but just to, I don't know, I'm curious about how you all got into the work that you did. I know some of you mentioned some parts, and there's some in the bio, but just how did you get really into the work as deeply as you do now? Where did it start?
I've talked a lot about what politicized me, but I think what mobilized me was, I mentioned I just wanted a job and couldn't get a job. But my journey started out as a youth worker. I was a young person in youth work, like many youth workers. And I think there's a different way of understanding temporality when you work with young people, a different way of seeing how like issues compound when you're working with young people. And also somehow in that context, the everyday, I don't want to make this all like cute, like, but the everyday joy that comes of working with young people is really profound. So that started my journey. Alongside that, I actually started a career as a musician and a theatre maker. So the idea of like rehearsal to me was, it was just in my everyday practice. The idea of going into a room, you have your collaborators, you have no idea what's going to come off the other side. And part of the way that you make a thing is literally being in practice and like making it, like building it as you make it, telling it as you make it, and then whatever you share is never the finished thing. It's never the perfect thing or the finite thing. But for me, that set off a whole journey of, I understand that an artist is really, what's the word? Adept? Oh, thanks. I should ask you. Is really adept at giving form to ideas, giving like materiality, nuance, context, story, and lots of other things. Can we do that for liberation? That was the question that I was always like carrying with me. We know how to give this form. What would it mean if we started to give liberation form? What would it mean if we started to rehearse liberation in the way that we do as artists? Was the question that I carried with me when starting MAIA. But one of the most practical things was I always knew that wasn't an isolated question. I didn't want to ask that alone. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to explore it alone. So how do we share that question as quickly as possible, find people who are asking similar questions, start to do things together? So we used to just put on like work in progress nights. It was more so people could get used to the idea of not perfection, like not finished, like forget output. Process is a beautiful, really generative thing. How do we celebrate and center that? Was the starting point. And then I actually went to university because my parent was like, you can either go to university or pay the council tax bill. So I was like, see you later, hun. And I went to university, but because I'd already had a journey as an artist, I said, I'll do what I love. I did theatre, I did Spanish. In theatre, I felt like I didn't get what I wanted. I didn't get what I hoped to get. I know how to make work. How do you have a life? How do you build like a livelihood from this? So I actually went back to my university once I graduated and I said, these are all the things that I didn't get. These are all the things that I didn't do. Can you let me design a module and teach it? And they said yes. And I've just always carried that audacity of whatever I see as gaps, I want to create for myself like what would I do with them? What would I propose? I don't just want to attack or critique or drag. What would I propose? So I just keep doing that. What do I want to propose here? And so what is my contribution? What is my offering? What can I learn from what we're doing? I think that's pretty much what I just keep doing.
Thank you. So I'm saying all of this in retrospect, but how I sort of got into my practice, I'll refer back to what Amahra was saying about madness. So there's this really good quote by the first president of Burkina Faso who decolonized Upper Volterra. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said in order to sort of want to see change, you have to harbor a certain amount of madness. Like you have to be crazy to want to go against the status quo. Even Tupac as well in his MTV interview, he said, he says, I'm burdened because I know how life should be. So it's sort of being a product of multicultural Britain, which is very much one of the most purest expressions of love in the UK. I grew up in that, and I grew up in a strong community of love. I'm Muslim, but I'd spend Christmas at my auntie's house, and like none of us, we don't have a shared mother tongue, but she'll treat me like her son. Do you know what I mean? So that sense of love was so strong that I started to lose my mind when I saw the opposite, or acts of aggression or violence, both slow and like physical violence, happening to people that I knew were the embodiment of love. And so I struggled with that for a very long time, and sort of saw it also embodied in the cities and buildings that were changing around me. And so that's where my loud mouth sort of, it was the only way I could sort of release and sort of resist against the violence that I was seeing. A lot of the violence I was seeing was also rooted in narrative. So just to give a bit of a short process, it's implicit bias creates over-policing, which creates data, which creates criminal geographical profiles, which feeds into a need to regenerate. And I saw that with South Kilburn, which is what Dhelia was talking about earlier. And I had a lot of friends who were experiencing this process of gentrification, alongside sort of these narratives of everyone here is a gangbanger, drug dealer, or killer. But I'm like, I'll show you my auntie. Like, she's really sweet. And like everywhere, like in every society, there are a small group of people who aren't inherently evil, are probably going through some things. And so it was 4 years today that another madman from a 10-minute walk down the road from my estate helped me challenge the narratives that we were living in. His name's Andre Anderson. I think he's somewhere in the room. He's not going to show himself, I know. But yeah. So this specific individual gave me the confidence to put my madness into words, and we dragged 22 other people with us to challenge those narratives. Now, in that exercise, I found out that I had already written the manifesto in the chapter that I created in this anthology that we wrote. And so it was literally only 2 years later that I took that chapter and added 80 pages to it. So that was sort of the stages of my metamorphosis.
Thank you so much. I kind of want to have loads of things that sparked up in my brain, but I know that I want to protect your time and everyone's time here and honor the space. So I wanted just a brief note on maybe where you're practicing freedom or where you see freedom practiced, and just a brief note.
It always comes to my mind whenever this kind of question is asked. For me, I am like I feel retired now, but I was a hardcore raver. Like, I took it so seriously, and I put in shifts, like real shifts. And you know, in retrospect, I'm like, oh, there was just like a real honest acknowledgement of that kind of haptic feedback, that kind of like real relational somatic experience that we were having to dirty bashment. Sorry. I think for me, anything to do with like movement and dance, which I really keep trying to preserve away from like workspaces, so I don't really talk about it because I just love it for me. But one of those other sites that feels like it's not really work, it's not really like there is no differentiation, is parenting. I feel like oh God, I love my children so much, and parenting for me has been a real liberatory rehearsal space, especially as a survivor of childhood violence. I am rehearsing into being the kind of life affirming parental relationship that I was yearning for. And it's one of those spaces where I'm like, it's not enough to talk about, I talk a lot about transformative justice, and I'm really in the movement. And for me, it's like that work starts at home. Like I literally have a family now, and it's like, it's so lit. But I get to practice who I want to be in the world, in this beautiful relationship with my children, who are also practicing with me. So that's it. Yeah, my babies are lit, I'm not gonna lie.
So mine's gonna sound very silly, but the most free that I feel like I can be within the current system that we're in is running. I think because I have the burden of sort of understanding spatial politics. Every time I walk down a particular street, I think to myself, I'm only really allowed to walk here because the London Borough of Harringay allows me to. Or like I'm only allowed to walk through King's Cross because Argent has allowed me to. But when I'm running, no one can catch me, even if you don't want me there. So for me, it's sort of resistance to the current structures that be, is a practice of freedom for me, and I think for me that's my rehearsal when it comes to like space. But I'm trying to be free standing still. So there's a bit of work to do before we get there. But yeah, I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to invite you all to thank our panelists for being phenomenal. And I know there's so much more we could have heard. So please do follow on, look at their work and follow where they are and invest and support. I know this conversation about neighborhoods is also speaking about spatial politics, is speaking about structures and things that loads of people, we were like, well, where do I fit into that conversation? Like, what can I do right now? And a few weeks ago, we had a conversation on, last week, on disability justice and the welfare state. And one of an incredible disability justice organizer, Tumu Johnson, raised this point of like, when in the beginning of a pandemic, everyone was like mutual aid, and like really involved with Sisters Car, like radical abolitionist politics. Was like, yes, I agree, but also as a disabled person, something was brought up for me, which is like, I don't feel comfortable asking my neighbor to do certain things. Like, we don't have those kinds of relationships yet. So we want to be able to build these mutual aid communities. We want to be able to have neighborhoods for life. And actually, many of us are not practicing what it takes to be those people. And actually, the people who need us most don't even trust that we can do that and that we will show up for it, or will be skillful enough to show up for it. So one of the invitations that I want to bring into this space is, yes, there are things that each of us can be doing in our professional capacities, in our organizing capacities, but there is also our day-to-day, who are we becoming, to the invitation that Dhelia brought into the space of like, what does it mean for us to organize around our values and have them lived through us in a relational way, that if everything goes and that's what it looks like, people can trust us to hold us, and when they're most vulnerable, that we know how to show up. And so I'm just bringing in this point that in the absence of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, that abolition is not the absence of policing, it's the presence of meaningful infrastructure, which includes us to each other. And so really just saying thank you for sharing your evening with us and for being part of our rehearsal. We've got 2 more weeks of rehearsing Freedoms. I know most things are fully booked out, but obviously with it getting darker and everything, there are wait lists that are being released. So do try and join us, and particularly uplift and support the work of Dhelia, Amahra and Nabil, who are doing their own rehearsals for all our Freedoms too. Thank you.